From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Thursday, June 4th, 2015. Pulitzer Prize-winning author Chris Hedges has a new book, Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. He'll join us to discuss what history can teach us and profile some of today's revolutionaries. And we'll turn to Caroline Fredrickson, senior fellow at Demos, to discuss the ongoing wage disparity between women and men, why women are disproportionately represented in low-wage and tipped industries, and what some solutions to the problems are. That's coming up after the news. Joining us to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika, assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for joining us. In a surprise move, Egypt's highest court of appeals has just revived charges against former dictator Hosni Mubarak for the 2011 killings of protesters. Mubarak had been freed last year after being tried for the same crime and had all charges dropped. The new trial will begin this November, and once it concludes, it cannot be appealed. Mass public outrage over Mubarak's earlier acquittal has fueled the disillusionment many Egyptians feel in the post-revolution era. Meanwhile, current President Abdel Fattah Al-Sisi, who has been likened to Mubarak for his repressive rule, has faced protests on an international arena recently during a Berlin meeting with German Chancellor Angela Merkel yesterday. Al-Sisi faced hundreds of demonstrators calling him a dictator. One woman called him a murderer during the press conference that followed. Al-Sisi claimed that he was working under, quote, difficult circumstances. Well, Chenjerai, is there hope that Egyptians won't let the current state of affairs continue for too long so that their revolution against Mubarak was not in vain?
Yes, I mean, I think, when you look at this conflict, most news agencies will invite us to see two sides of the problem. On one hand, they'll condemn the dictatorship of Mubarak, the Islamic extremism of Morsi, and the excessive use of the death penalty and other violence by the current president, Al-Sisi. And then in this frame, they try to paint the governance structures of the West, with Obama and Merkel and others that are pressuring these governments as the humane alternative. What I think we have to remember is that the U.S. supported Mubarak during some of the most vicious parts of his regime, supplying him with both aid and weapons. And it was the people of Egypt, not the U.S., who led the uprising to remove Mubarak. And also, we have to look closely at the words of Merkel. I mean, she's concerned about Egypt because of the security of Germany and all of Europe, quoting her. So we should therefore look at the ways that Western imperialist power works closely together with extreme Islam and dictatorships to repress democratic progress in the Middle East.
Good point. And then Ukraine continues to remain volatile with a new wave of violence that has claimed nearly 24 lives this week alone. A ceasefire agreed upon earlier this year in Minsk between the Ukrainian government and pro-Russian rebels has been completely eviscerated. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko issued a dire warning in the capital, Kiev, today of a, quote, colossal threat of the resumption of large-scale hostilities by Russian and terrorist forces, end of quote. He added, quote, Ukraine's military should be ready for a new offensive by the enemy, as well as a full-scale invasion along the entire border with the Russian Federation. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov blamed Ukraine for the latest upsurge in violence. International monitors with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe say they have observed the movement of a large amount of heavy weapons in the rebel-controlled area of Donetsk. So far, 8,000 people have been killed since the conflict began over a year ago. Well, Chenjerai, how volatile is this situation? Media are reporting that no one really expects a full-scale war, but clearly Ukraine's president seems to be very worried.
Yes, well, I think, we have to zoom out a little bit. I mean, Putin has made his intentions clear in Ukraine. And this escalation is worrisome because as national leaders like Putin intensify their military solutions and military efforts, it's citizens who wind up paying the price. One example of this is Putin's recent declaration that military deaths are state secrets. And so many are worried that, if we can't report military deaths, for example, in eastern Ukraine, we're not going to really see the accurate costs of war. On the U.S. side, we've seen John McCain advocate for arming Ukrainians, and even some recent things that, we don't have all the details yet, but have to do with what George Soros is even recommending, that, are really not based, again, in a concern for Ukrainians, but more so, as John McCain put it, trying to counter a perception that the United States is weak.
And finally, the New York Times and CBS have just released a new poll about wealth inequality, labor rights, and international trade in the U.S. Not surprisingly, a majority of Americans see inequality as a huge problem and want the government to actively intervene. Specifically, 68% of those polled say they want an increase in taxes on millionaires, and 71% say the federal minimum wage needs to rise from $7.25 an hour to $10.10 an hour. On workers' rights, the numbers are even higher, with 80% wanting employers to offer paid leave for new parents and caregivers, and 85% wanting paid sick leave. On international trade, however, most respondents just didn't know enough about the Trans-Pacific Partnership to answer the questions. That ignorance is part of what activists organizing against the TPP are denouncing, with the House of Representatives expected to take up the issue of fast-track authority for President Obama to negotiate the massive international trade deal. Secrecy abounds. Leaked portions of the TPP show that workers' rights and the environment are at great risk. Well, Chenjerai, do you think the New York Times and CBS will actually see the results of this poll as an indication that they need to do a better job on exposing the TPP?
I hope so. We don't really know enough about the TPP. But what we know about this fast-track legislation is that it seems to be setting a disturbing precedent for how trade legislation is going to be governed going forward. I mean, Bernie Sanders talks about the effects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership on American workers, and then others have talked about that it potentially will threaten net neutrality. But we haven't heard as much about how it will affect developing countries, and it seems that it's likely to raise drug prices in the developing world, according to Oxfam and Stiglitz and others. So here we're seeing the true face of the Obama administration and his willingness to cooperate with Republicans to push through legislation that goes against what the people in the country are increasingly demanding.
Chenjerai, thank you as always for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Chenjerai Kumanyika is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Throughout history, tyrannical regimes have faced revolutions. Some have succeeded, others have failed. Today, with the unprecedented level of global wealth inequality and the power of corporate and government elites to make decisions that negatively impact the mass of people on the planet, the imperative for revolt is greater than ever. But when will it come? What will it look like? What lessons can we learn from the past? Taking on these grand questions is a frequent guest on Uprising, the acclaimed veteran journalist and best-selling author Chris Hedges. Hedges has reported from more than 50 countries. He was a correspondent at the New York Times, where as part of a group of reporters, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of terrorism. He's currently a columnist for Truthdig and will be speaking this Sunday at an event for Truthdig in Southern California, which we'll tell you more about. Hedges is also a senior fellow at the Nation Institute, and he's written a number of best-selling books, including Empire of Illusion, Death of the Liberal Class, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which he co-wrote with Joe Sacco. His brand new book, just out from Nation Books, is called Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt, and he now joins me on video stream. Welcome to Uprising, Chris.
Thank you, Sonali.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you at the Truth Dig event this Sunday. It's happening at the Aratani Theatre at 5 p.m. and I will be moderating that event, and we'll be hearing much more from you about your book. But I want to begin by asking you to set the stage for one issue that you bring up throughout your book, where you say that revolutions are often unpredictable, that it takes years for the idea that the current system is bankrupt to spread, and often elites actually have no idea that people's minds are changing. Can you expand on that a bit more? Can you give us an example?
Well, this draws from some of the great theorists on revolution, Crane Brinton, Davies, Alexander Berkman, and others, who talk about that process when the potency of the ruling ideology, and as Karl Marx understood, ideologies serve economic power, in this case, of course, neoliberalism, the free market, globalization. When those ideologies lose their efficacy, when people understand that the promises, trickle-down economics, etc., are a lie, then they enter into this period that Antonio Gramsci calls an interregnum, where you have yet to formulate an alternative vision, but the ideology, the ruling ideology, has essentially been exposed as a tool to further the interests of a very narrow power elite. And I think that's where we are. We see indications of it across the cultural and political spectrum. Congress's approval rating at 7%. Deep frustration, again, across the political spectrum over warrantless wiretapping, eavesdropping, monitoring, over the bailing out of Wall Street, frustration over these endless imperial wars that, of course, a small group of arms manufacturers, obscenely wealthy, frustration over the stripping away of our most basic and cherished civil liberties, including habeas corpus, due process with the passage of Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. But in calcified, dying regimes, it doesn't matter what the citizenry wants. I mean, a small example of that is what's happening today in Denton, Texas, where the community overwhelmingly has voted to ban fracking, and the Texas Senate essentially passes a bill saying it's against the law for any community to control their own destiny. So all of these are messages. Black Lives Matter marching through the streets of Baltimore, Ferguson, New York, and other cities, and yet, and courtesy of the Washington Post, an investigative piece in the Post, we're watching mostly poor people of color, 2 a day, being murdered by militarized police forces. This phenomena of actually having video of police killing an unarmed civilian and then walking free with no repercussions. So the inability of the state to respond, the predatory nature of the state, which really functions more and more nakedly to discredit these ideas, creates this period of uncertainty. And I think that that's where we are. And when something erupts, it's often been fermenting below the surface for a long time, as Berkman writes out in his essay Invisible Revolution. He likens it to water that's being boiled in a kettle. You see finally at the end the steam and the whistle, hear the whistle, but it's a long process. And I think that process is probably describes pretty well the American landscape.
I think it certainly is important for us to also then discuss what the nature of revolutions can look like by examining history. And a very important question that you take up in your book is the debate of violent versus non-violent revolutions. You cite the example of the Zapatistas that started out as an armed group promising violent reprisal, but then transformed themselves. And you have the opposite happening in Syria, where an unarmed, non-violent movement got taken over by armed rebels, and we see the result horribly apparent today. Is it a matter even of just practicality that non-violent revolutions tend to succeed more often than violent revolutions, and that in itself should be an indication of what direction rebellion that might be fermenting below the surface could take?
Yes. I mean, I have to add this caveat that it's always the government or the state that finally determines the configurations of revolt. I covered the civil war in El Salvador, and after the military coup, there were huge protests, peaceful protests in the capital of San Salvador, labor leaders, student groups, etc. And the response of the military regime in 1979 was to set up machine guns on the roofs of downtown buildings and open fire on the crowd, which triggered the long insurgency, which I spent 5 years covering. So the longer the state doesn't respond, I mean, for instance, the longer people march through the streets protesting the indiscriminate use of lethal force by militarized police against unarmed civilians, and nothing happens, then eventually you get counter-violence. That's just an inevitability. I don't want to see us go there, but it's kind of out of our hands. The string of shootings of police officers we've seen over the last month, New York, Mississippi, and other places, these may just be isolated incidents. I hope they are. But that's the kind of response you get when the state kills with impunity, represses with impunity, and doesn't respond to the very legitimate demands and grievances of a citizenry. Davies and Brinton, I think, correctly point out, and I quote them at the beginning of the book, that no revolution succeeds until a significant portion of the internal security defects. This was true in the Russian Revolution, when the Cossacks would no longer crush the bread rioters in Petrograd on behalf of the Tsar. It was true in 1979, when after the Shah fled and his armed forces wouldn't protect him. It was true in the Cuban Revolution after Bautista fled, and again, his armed forces would no longer resist on behalf of a discredited regime. We saw the same thing in Nicaragua with Somoza. That's how revolutions work. It was true in East Germany, which a revolution that I covered, when Erich Honecker sent an elite paratroop division to Leipzig to fire on the crowd. They refused to do it. Honecker lasted less than a week in power after that. So revolutions have a very important dynamic, one that Václav Havel captured in his great 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, is that they speak an undeniable truth to power. They denounce the corrupt inner workings of power that is designed to enrich a cabal of elite oligarchs. And we certainly replicate that. And you get the foot soldiers of the elite, those who are tasked to maintain control and use coercion to defend that elite, no longer willing to do that. And then these elites are finished. So that's a fun, and that's why the state seeks to demonize opposition movements. And, you know, I've clashed with the Black Bloc over this issue,
right,
and marginalize it because it's far more easily controlled. But and I would just add as a caveat, that's different from colonial uprisings, which almost inevitably have to use violence, including our own. We call it the American Revolution, but it was an uprising against, at that time, the greatest imperial power in the world, Britain, and they sent over one of the largest armadas that they had ever formed to besiege New York with Prussian mercenaries. So our revolution is probably better described as a colonial overthrow. And colonial battles, as we have seen throughout the developing world especially, have had to employ violence to rid themselves of an occupying power. But when you talk about revolution, it's an internal phenomena, and it has different dynamics.
So in terms of how ordinary Americans might see themselves participating in overturning our current system, we saw maybe a glimpse of that during the Occupy Wall Street movement, where large numbers of Americans, many of whom had never been active before, took the bold step of simply camping out in their cities very visibly. But still, it seems sort of a faraway thing, even for Americans who might be aware of how deep the problem runs guns and but might feel completely helpless. You profile in your book a number of Americans who have very bravely taken such serious steps that they have not just risked incarceration but experienced incarceration and persecution. People like Lynn Stewart, and you talk about Julian Assange and Edward Snowden and Mumia Abu-Jamal. Is there a quality in those people, those rebels and revolutionaries, that you can distill for our audience so that we can understand what it is that drives heroes like that?
Well, with the exception of Snowden, all of those people I visited and interviewed, in Mumia in prison, Jeremy Hammond in prison, Lynn Stewart shortly after her release because she has stage 4 cancer from prison, Julian Assange, of course, who's under house arrest virtually in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Yeah, they're kind of like religious mystics. And, Baldwin has a great essay talking about rebels and artists, where he said they're not so much driven towards a vision as possessed by a vision. And I think that's right. And these, part of the reason that these figures are so heavily persecuted by the state is because they refuse to compromise. For them, revolt is a moral imperative. And Hannah Arendt writes about this when she says that, in moments of extremity, those who resist are not those who say this shouldn't be done or this can't be done, but those, or shouldn't be done or oughtn't to be done, but those who say, just quite frankly, I can't. And that is the quality of the rebel. Rebels are different from revolutionaries. That's a point that Ronnie Kasriels makes. He was one of the founders, along with Nelson Mandela, of the armed wing of the ANC, but he's white South African, Jewish, and he said, I'm a rebel in that I turned on my own. I turned on my own class. I turned on my own race. Nelson Mandela was a revolutionary. And of course, rebels very usually or very swiftly become heretics within the power structure once those that they are battling are overthrown. This was true with Che Guevara, was true with Kasriels, who denounced the corruption within the ANC and spoke out against the shooting of the miners on strike. You can go to Yugoslavia with Milo Vangelis, his early book, The New Class, condemning the communist elite for replicating the lifestyles and privileges of the old elite. But rebels are absolutely vital if you're going to move forward. The other thing about, periods like this is that, and I speak from experience, having covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe or the Palestinian uprisings, the street demonstrations that brought down Slobodan Milosevic, is that when it unravels, because the facade, it appears that everything is stable and nothing has changed on the surface. But there's that internal kind of eating away at the ideological superstructures that holds power in place. And when it unravels at an absolutely dizzying speed. I just spoke in Boston 2 days ago, and many people there are involved in trying to stop the Kinder Morgan and another pipeline that are bringing tar sands bitumen literally down through the city of Boston to the port. And I said to them, writing Markey, the governor, or Warren, the senator, isn't going to work. That at this point, the only thing you can do is begin to collect junk cars. And when that construction equipment starts moving through those city streets to build that pipeline, you have to drive those cars out in the street, lift the battery out of the car and walk away, and you have to do it day after day after day. This is a tactic, of course, was used by the French farmers when they drove their tractors into Paris. But that's the kind of activity that we have to do. Again, going back to Denton, you have the police shaking the hands of the people who are blocking the fracking sites, thanking them for their public service, taking them to the police station and releasing them on their own recognizance. That's absolutely deadly to the state. And when you have that kind of support and that kind of understanding that has seeped into the very structures that the state uses for control, then the state becomes very weak.
So, Chris, for those Americans who may not feel that they have that almost religious zeal, that vision, is it then just a matter of reaching a point where rebellion is the only course of action, where there is no other option left because people are just getting pushed too far? But when you do that, of course, you risk everything. You risk your life.
Well, rebels are kind of a peculiar breed, and most people don't have that DNA to turn around as Jeremy Hammond did in a federal court and raise his fist and shout "Long live anarchy." But I think rebels give us the narrative. I was every night in the Magic Lantern Theater in Prague during the Velvet Revolution with Václav Havel, and Havel wasn't a particularly gifted speaker. He wasn't very charismatic, but he had the moral authority, even though, of course, he'd been a non-person since 1977 with the founding of Charter 77. In Czechoslovakia, his plays were not performed, his essays weren't published, but everybody knew at that point that that was a figure that they could trust. That was a figure who had held fast and suffered, and of course been imprisoned because of their vision, because of their integrity. And so I think that we are reaching a point where larger and larger numbers of the citizenry realize that it doesn't matter what we want. It doesn't matter what our rights are. The TPP and the CAFTA are just another example where we have this absurd scenario where this major trade policy, which will eviscerate the rights of workers, the regulations that we pose, what are left of them to protect the environment, are taken from us, and yet we're not even allowed to see what's in the treaty. Even our elected representatives who who get permission to go into the room and see copies, not only can they take notes, they're banned from speaking about it. I mean, this is insane. And of course, the reason that it's secret is because there would be a national outcry if the details were public. This is kind of the march of unchecked corporate power, which is, I wrote a column on Monday called Why Karl Marx Was Right, which, as Marx understood, in the final stage of capitalism, sees this strange phenomena where capitalist forces consume or cannibalize the very structures that once made capitalism possible. And that is what we've seen with the impoverishment of the working class and the assault on the middle class, which is the bulwark of a capitalist democracy. And increasingly, these corporations prey on the state in order to make money, whether that's intelligence agencies. 70% of our intelligence is handled by corporations, the huge arms industry. We just passed this gigantic, the House Appropriations Bill, $600 billion plus for defense spending, 12 new Ohio-class submarines at $8 billion apiece. The subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, $5.4 trillion worldwide. This scam that the banks pulled fixing currency rates, and they were just, paid a fine of $9 billion to the government. But as the New York Times pointed out, they made profits of 80-some billion dollars, which was kind of a sweet deal for them. I mean, so all of these scenarios of, the final kind of denouement of a civilization or of an empire are being played out daily as we speak and are becoming painfully real to more and more citizens. And you finally reach a point of frustration where these rebels, these figures, Chomsky, Nader, others who have spoken out like this and essentially been in the wilderness, suddenly their honesty just ripples through the entire society, and people realize that if they don't act, there will be no end to the exploitation and the the final extinguishing of everything that makes life sustainable, including, of course, the ecosystem itself.
Well, Chris, I'm looking forward to seeing you on Sunday in Los Angeles. I want to thank you so much for joining us today and have safe travels.
Thank you, Sonali. I'll see you on Sunday.
Chris Hedges is my guest, and we've been talking about his brand new book, Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. For our Southern California audience, he's speaking this Sunday at a Truth Dig event at the Artani Theater, 244 South San Pedro Street. Doors open at 4:30 p.m., and tickets are available at kpfk.org. If you find the banner with the Chris Hedges event and click on it, it'll take you to a link, or you can also go to truthdig.com. Tickets are limited, so if you want to go, don't wait. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. A new United Nations report has found that women worldwide earn significantly less than men, even though they're working longer hours. Despite the growing visibility of women in higher tiers of the corporate world, by and large, women are nowhere close to achieving wage parity. Here in the United States, women are ranked 65th in wage parity as raised by presidential candidate Hillary Clinton in her recent address to the Women in the World Summit in New York City. Now, Caroline Fredrickson, president of the American Constitution Society, details the myriad ways in which women are being thrown, quote, under the bus, which is actually the title of her new book. Caroline Fredrickson is also a senior fellow at Demos and has written about many important constitutional issues. She's also the former director of the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office and was general counsel and legal director of NARAL Pro-Choice America. Welcome to Uprising, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Sonali. It's a pleasure to be on.
Now, broadly speaking, I suppose we shouldn't at all be surprised at the global state of women's workplace inequality. It's this concrete measure of historical sexism that's been around probably as long as our species has, right?
Well, you know, it's hard to know actually how much has been around since the beginning and how much we've just seen happen through culture and discrimination and so forth. So I always hesitate to sort of agree to that kind of a scenario because it makes it sound almost like it's a natural occurrence and that it's built into the genders.
Right. Now, your book focuses primarily on women in the U.S., and as the world's supposedly most wealthy and advanced nation, a beacon for democracy and equality, is it all the more shocking given how low we rank on a global scale for things like women's wages? And in fact, where are we on the global scale?
Well, you know, I think it's very true. We are not nearly as high as we'd like to think we are. And I think I mean, it surprised me actually when I started looking into some of the issues. You know, we have a number of reasons why we don't rank as high. One is that we don't do anything in terms of childcare, really. We have the most minimal provisions for women, lower income women, but only 18% of eligible children even qualify for what our government provides. That's a vast majority of those children who are even in that low income level who can't get in, which affects their mothers very deeply in terms of what kind of jobs they can have, what kind of training and education. And then, of course, we don't have paid family leave, except for the very few, the very lucky, the upper levels of income, and mostly white women, honestly. And actually, men are the ones who most benefit from paid family leave, which is the irony. But then beyond that, in terms of wages, we have not addressed some very important issues of the statutory framework that we have, and this is where I was sort of most surprised, that we think we have this great set of laws that protects women against discrimination, that provides a minimum wage and overtime. But in fact, there are large groups of women who are not protected by those laws, and that leads to a lot of perverse outcomes, such as women who are in domestic work getting worked far more hours than they should be, not making any overtime, not even making a minimum wage, at least not as required by law. And so you have these groups of women who are really falling behind, and no surprise, they tend to be women of color, and many of them are immigrant women.
You open your book telling the story of your own grandmother, a poor immigrant woman, and it's easy to sort of lose ourselves in the statistics. But tell us a little bit about that story and why it was sort of a personal inspiration for you.
Well, it was actually my great grandmother came from Sweden, and she was came on her own in her teens, very, very poor. And, I just think it's a story that is very true for a lot of Americans. When we lose sight of that, we lose sight of the fact that there are more and more people coming in who still face these same situations, and particularly for the domestic workers. And my great grandmother worked in a fancy, rich people's house in Boston. She was a scullery maid, kind of the lowest level of person in the kitchen. She didn't speak any English. And people say to me, well, doesn't that show you that the American dream is still true? And that, why do we need all this government help when your own story tells that people can move forward? Well, I have a few answers to that. One is, well, my great-grandparents were all white. They were all Northern European. They were all Protestant. But also the thing that people forget is that my great-grandfather was a working man. And when my great-grandmother met my great-grandfather, he was a Teamster. And there were actually ways that people could have decent paying jobs even without being educated, and really move themselves up in the world. Those jobs don't exist anymore. Our union movement has fallen apart. And I think it's actually an example of why some people were able to rise at a certain point in time. And we don't have that structure. It's one reason why I talk about unions in my book, because I think they have been such an important part of helping working families, and particularly women, better their situations. But they are just so weakened now by the continued onslaught from the right. And I certainly think it should be a major focus of policies to figure out how to improve people's access to organizing.
So on the issue of unions, we know that there's a strong correlation between union representation and overall wages being higher for those people who are unionized. But what about wage parity? Do women represented by a union tend to have wages that are more equal to the men in that union? Or do we know that data?
Absolutely. No, it's absolutely women who are in organized jobs who have a union have much closer wage parity. And not only that, but they have much better benefits. They have much more flexibility in their schedules, much more likely to have paid leave. So in all of the variables that we talked about before about why it is that American women don't rate as high as women in many other countries in the world because of the policies that we follow in the United States, unions are the counter to that. If more women were unionized, we would actually rank much higher.
Now, how disproportionately represented are women in not just low-wage industries, but also tipped industries? On our program, we had had a real close look at how tipped workers are being thrown under the bus, to paraphrase your book title, even compared to other low-wage workers in the fight for a higher minimum wage. But it's often, or it's a majority women, I understand, that are part of the tipped workforce.
Absolutely, more than a majority. It's almost 3/4. And most of those workers are in the restaurant industry, which is not surprising, but they're also, they work at hair salons and manicurists and so forth. And the ugly reality is that we haven't raised the tip minimum wage since the early 1990s. It's $2.13 an hour. I mean, people don't even seem to realize that. And when I tell them that, it just produces this look of incredible surprise that somehow that could be the wage that anyone in the United States would make. But we forget that. And I think many people forget that when they go out to eat and they go to a restaurant. But particularly if you're in one of where most of the women dominate is in these sort of casual restaurants. It's a macaroni grill or a place like that. People don't really think about leaving a tip, but we shouldn't actually expect these workers to have to, depend on, people feeling particularly generous that day. The idea that there's not just a base minimum wage for all workers, and in fact, it should be much higher, uh, far more higher than it is, and that's why I'm very taken by the fight for 15. But even if we can get to 12, that'll bring people up somewhat. But we cannot leave the tipped workers behind.
Because that's leaving women behind.
It's absolutely
Now,
leaving women behind.
what about, you mentioned manicurists. The New York Times recently had this lengthy expose on the nail industry in New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The reporter, Sarah Maslany, found that, quote, among the more than 100 workers interviewed by the Times, and this is of the workers in New York that she interviewed, only about a quarter said that they were paid an amount that was the equivalent of New York State's minimum hourly wage. All but 3 workers, however, had wages withheld in other ways that would be considered illegal, such as never getting overtime. I'm guessing you're not very surprised by these findings.
I'm not, and most of them aren't even entitled to overtime. It just happens to be, different examples. But if you work for a small business, or your particular independent contractors, a lot of manicurists and hair women who work at hair salons are actually treated as independent contractors, so they're not even guaranteed overtime. I think New York is more protective in that regard. But that is absolutely common. One of the big problems with the tipped minimum wage is that the enforcement is very complicated, because what has to happen in theory is that a worker is entitled to a minimum wage. But with tipped workers, what we're assuming is that somehow the tips that they get will bring them up to the minimum wage. Whereas sometimes you have employers, restaurants that will say, oh, you actually made more than the minimum wage, so we're going to withhold some of your pay because you shouldn't make more than the minimum wage. But in fact, there are many, many occasions, and there have been a lot of lawsuits that document this, not enough, unfortunately, because so many women are not being paid their wages, but that show that it is certainly a good bet for companies not to sort of fill in above the tipped employee to the minimum wage level, because it's so hard to enforce that almost always the employer is going to be getting work at almost slave labor prices.
Right. And of course, many, many women, perhaps the majority in, for example, the nail industry, which we were just talking about, are also immigrant women. How are particularly undocumented women in the country faring in terms of wages? They have that added layer of vulnerability of being undocumented.
No, absolutely right. It's really complicated. Because for many women, it's not just that they're afraid, because if they bring issues forward that they might lose their jobs, which they depend on so desperately, and they might, in fact, lose their, if they're undocumented, they might come and be turned over to to ICE for deportation. But there are also some of our so-called protective laws actually do not provide protections to undocumented workers at all. And so even were they to come forward, there would be no protection for them. So it is really a completely perverse system, that we should recognize that workers have rights and keep our immigration questions and enforcement issues in terms of our border separate from worker protections, because if you don't, and if they start to mix, then all of a sudden we get these very perverse incentives where employers really have workers over a barrel. They'll hire undocumented workers, and then they can threaten to deport them if an undocumented worker dares to raise issues about not being paid a minimum wage or getting overtime. And one area where this really plays out is in sexual harassment. And particularly for immigrant women, they work in a lot of types of jobs like farm work, domestic work, where they are highly subject to sexual harassment. And the obvious problem is they're not protected by the law, and they're highly dependent on their employer. And there have been some really, really heartbreaking reports documenting the types of sexual assault and even rape that happen to women with really no recourse.
Now, Caroline, we just talked about tipped workers. There's also temp workers. And in your book, you talk about the rise of the permanent temp. How serious a problem is this and how vulnerable are women workers when they're essentially just kept on temporarily, indefinitely?
Well, this is an issue that I actually I hope we can build common cause across genders and race, because this is the issue of now and of the future. The rise of the temp workers is a phenomenon in which more and more companies are hiring temps when they have maybe a decent, at least decently paid workforce, and they start creating a two-tier workforce, and they bring on temps through temp agencies that hire them at lower wages and lower benefits. And this has happened with some of the big car companies in the South. Nissan is somewhat infamous for having the majority of its workers in Tennessee are actually temp workers. And so what it does, it bifurcates the workforce, but not just in terms of wages, but also in terms of general protections for workers, because temp workers are also, and this is really, as you can see, it's a major theme of my book, but the exemptions that we have in our laws allow employers to really manipulate the status of employees, and that's whether you're called an independent contractor or a temp worker or a part-time worker, that those kinds of designations really allow the employer to reduce the number of workers they have to protect against discrimination, that they have to provide minimum wage to, or overtime, or that are allowed to even join a union. And so women are obviously, we are the ones who are most vulnerable. And so this group of temp workers there are very many women. And I think, but we really need to wrestle with this in the United States, because this is a pattern and a paradigm that more employers are adopting, and more and more men are going to be affected by this.
And actually, on this issue of men versus women, how do you respond to those who might say, well, all workers are suffering in this economy, that we should be fighting for all workers' rights? Why are you just pointing out the fact that women workers are being screwed over, thrown under the bus?
Well, exactly. And I pointed out because, as I said, I think women are the canary in the coal mine. Women have experienced more quickly and more deeply the types of fragmentations in our workplace that are now becoming more and more mainstream. And so I raise this because the kinds of exemptions that have affected women, including categories of workers who are left out of our labor protections, those kinds of jobs are the jobs that are becoming more and more prevalent in the American economy. So a lot of service jobs are the ones that the Department of Labor has identified as the fastest growing and the ones that are likely to have the most number of employees going forward. So, I think that looking out for women, who are, by the way, the 51%. So I think when you start caring about women workers, you are actually caring about the majority of workers. But really, these types of trends are expanding. And employers are exploiting them. And so, I really think it's an opportunity, through calling attention to sort of the origins of many of these holes in our labor protections, which come out of a history of racism and misogyny. But looking at that and then sort of seeing where it goes, you see more and more employers taking advantage of these kinds of loopholes that were created initially during the New Deal to make sure that African Americans living in the South couldn't take advantage of the right to organize or get a minimum wage.
Caroline Fredrickson is my guest, and we're talking about her book, Under the Bus, How Working Women Are Being Run Over. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I want to discuss some of the corporate responses to women's conditions in the workplace. We've heard of leaning in or opting out. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. We turn back to our guest, Caroline Fredrickson. She's the president of the American Constitution Society. Her new book is called Under the Bus: How Working Women Are Being Run Over. Caroline, let's talk about the corporate response to the crisis of women who are working and getting thrown under the bus. It's best exemplified by Facebook executive Sheryl Sandberg, whose 2013 book, Lean In, asserted that it's, women's fault if they're getting left behind in the economy, and if they only leaned in and acted maybe more like men and became more aggressive, they would do better. Now, as you can tell, I sort of detest this patronizing approach. What is your response?
Well, so I do think there are some issues that Sheryl Sandberg raises that we should encourage more conversation about in a broader sense of the kind of cultural constraints that women grow up with. I think the way that women are discouraged from succeeding, from being smart, the whole something I was always sensitive to as a kid, but the dumb blonde kind of perspective that women are labeled with if they whether they try and be smart or they hide their intelligence. But there are certainly, so I give her credit for putting that out there. But when she and the conversation that was going on between her and Anne Marie Slaughter, in some sense, I think it was a conversation in the sense that people were hearing the lean in message, and then there was a counter message called the opt out message, which
Right.
Anne Marie Slaughter sort of exemplified about how for women, this was high striving women could not be both successful in the workplace and have a successful home life. And what just really frustrated me about the conversation was that there was so much taken for granted, and that was all women are upper middle class white women with a graduate degree in some kind of profession who are married and have children and are trying to figure out how to, how many nannies they should hire and how they should deal with the house cleaner. As well as, as Sheryl Sandberg, I really do feel terrible for her with her loss of her husband.
Yes, of course.
What she does say is how important it is to have a partner who is supportive of you. And I fully endorse that viewpoint. And I'm very sorry for her loss. But
her husband just recently passed away in a freak accident. Yeah. Well, and actually, the point, of course, is that women who want to be mothers, even it seems as in the upper middle class to the 1%ers, are essentially being forced to stay at home or choosing, in this case, opting out to stay at home because they can afford to. They might have husbands or be independently wealthy. But we started our conversations talking about how such a huge reason why women are really being hurt in this economy is because of the lack of support for many women who want to be mothers. There's almost no maternity leave that's required, depending on the state you live in. Childcare is so unaffordable. So can you focus on that a little bit and how those women who might have the option of opting out rarely have to worry about this?
Well, thank you, Sonali, for that question. And one of the things that I was really amazed by in doing the research for Under the Bus was looking into the history of childcare in our country. And one of the issues around motherhood that is really so interesting and probably won't take any of the listeners by surprise because it's so intuitively obvious. But, we have a really, I would say, hypocritical view of motherhood in this country in that we have very much celebrated the stay-at-home mom, the kind of traditional woman wearing an apron and baking pies, who's there for her 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 kids. But that woman and that mother is a white woman, and father knows best, the Mayberry, you think of all those kind of classic American TV shows. But we've had another view of motherhood that has affected low-wage women of color, and that is this kind of welfare queen, lazy women, and the whole welfare reform effort that was really structured to push women into the workplace, even if they were a single mom, even if they had very young kids, even without providing them with training, with support, with support to pay for transportation to a job, and all of those things. And we've kind of maintained this duality in our perception of women, and that has played into the childcare issue in the United States because we did experiment with childcare during World War II. It was a very small program. It was poorly run and underfunded, and it was only put in place because those kind of women, those mothers, white mothers, were in the factories because we needed it for the war effort. And so it was still not celebrated. Rosie the Riveter, by the way, doesn't seem like she was a mom, because all of the conversation about mothers at the time was really about how mothers shouldn't be working unless they really had to. Women need to be in the workforce, but mothers preferably not. So there was this very small program which was immediately dissolved at the end of World War II, and men came back, and women were pushed out of those factory jobs and back into low-paid jobs if they were in the workforce at all. And then there was another experiment, and this was so fascinating. In the 70s, there was an effort to establish a child care expansion that would have included more than Head Start includes, to have a broader base of families, and really, sort of up into middle income families who would have been able to benefit from starting to create a kind of extension of our public school system. But the same groups that organized to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment organized to defeat the child care law. Of course, right. And there was this group, and this is, it's sort of funny, except that the consequences are so tragic, but there was a group called the 4 Ws, which meant women who want to be women. Literally, wow. This was, and they were active in the ERA fight, and they led the charge in getting President Nixon to veto the legislation. They described how these terrible feminists were going to be breaking down the family and taking their husbands away from them and perverting their children, and all sorts of crazy things. But as a result, the women who really needed this help, women who can't opt out, and to go back to that conversation, the real needs for childcare are not for the women who struggle with, should I stay home or should I work? And it's a choice. What are the sort of cultural issues? But it's for the women who really don't have a choice. I have no problems with women who want to stay home and raise their children at home. If that is really a choice, that's great. But what worries me a lot more is the women who don't have a choice at all, because they really they need the money. And when childcare is so phenomenally expensive in this country and so unavailable for low-income families, we have a real situation, because, as I looked into some of the data for Under the Bus, I looked at the Department of Labor data on childcare arrangements, and they have a whole category that's called self-care. So I'm sure I don't need to spell that out for the viewers what that means.
Self-care.
Yes, it's just, I could not believe the euphemism. When we're talking about leaving kids alone, it is a phenomenon that was documented at the beginning of the 20th century, when people used to chain their kids to tables so they could go off to the factories, because they couldn't really put them anywhere, and there wasn't accessible childcare. Well, we're still in that situation. People may not be chaining their kids to the table, but they don't have anywhere to put them if they can't find family members to take care of them. It's a desperate struggle to pay the extraordinary cost of childcare.
I've been speaking with Caroline Fredrickson, a senior fellow at Demos, who's written about many important constitutional issues, and we've been discussing her new book, Under the Bus: How Working Women Are Being Run Over. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. She's also our technical director today, along with Alexander Hobbs. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Kiana Turner and Federico Garcia are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe now to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscription sustains the TV production of this program. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. And by the way, happy birthday, Quetzal Flores. I'll see you next time.